So good afternoon and welcome to this webinar. It's the first in a series of webinars presented from the CRACoWi project. We are an EU-funded project which is increasing the awareness about the Becoming Cyber Resilience Act, and we're also building a compliance tool for SMEs to use. So today I want to talk to you about threat modeling in the context of the CRA. It's a very central part of the CRA, and it's about finding the weak spots in a system before an attacker can do that. So we're going to go through a couple of points today. I'm going to give you a broad overview of the CRA and see where the threat modeling fits into that. There are many threat modeling approaches we can use and also a variety of tools available to execute them. I've chosen one particular approach, which I'm going to go through with you today. So we're going to take an IoT device, an ICS device, and run them through their paces. We're first going to look at the devices at three different levels, 0, 1, and 2, and we're going to use data flow diagrams to look at them. Then we're going to use the STRIDE framework to identify the relevant threats to these devices. Then we're going to use the MITRE framework, which is a knowledge base of attacks, real life attacks. Then I'm going to talk about risk prioritization, which is actually the next step after the threat modeling. And then we'll look at how you can take this threat modeling and continue to use this information throughout the life cycle of your product. So in the CRA, we have different roles. We have the manufacturer, who is burdened with the majority of the documentation. They need to track for vulnerabilities that might arise in the product as well. And all of the other roles, all of the other parties end up referring back to the manufacturer as the source of their information. Then we have importers who bring products in. Importers need to make sure that the documentation is there, and if it's a company, a manufacturer outside of the EU, and the importer wants to bring this device in under all circumstances, they can do that by taking over the responsibility of the manufacturer. This means that the importer in this case would be responsible for the documentation, they'd also be responsible for the vulnerability management. So it's a big responsibility to take on. Distributors, so within the EU, they don't have to prove that the products are compliant, but they do need to make sure that the CE mark is on the product and that the documentation is complete. Then we have the Market Surveillance Authority. They basically keep an eye on everything's going on and make sure that the CRA is being enforced in the wild. Critical infrastructure is a part of this. They don't have to execute the CRA documentation part itself, but they will be affected if their suppliers get it wrong. And then finally, we have the notified bodies who are responsible for the compliance assessment. And all of these roles are going to need to find new kind of tools, even if it's just to organize the paperwork that comes in and out in accordance with the CRA. But as I mentioned before, the majority of the responsibility lies by the manufacturer. So the focus of the CRA is really strongly for secure by design and secure by default. And the idea is that manufacturers begin to think about security before the product actually starts to be built. It should be thought about during the design phase. So we can see on the left-hand side, Annexes 1 and 2 talk about the security obligations. There we have secure by design. We also need to make sure that the device receives secure updates during its lifetime. And also really important is that there is adequate user documentation. Annexes 3 and 4 Annexes 3 and 4 are all about the scoping. So which category does your product falls into will determine the amount of scrutiny that it gets. And then we have administrative compliance in Annexes 5 to 8, which is about the paperwork, the declarations, documentation, and the conformity assessment itself. So the CRA states very clearly right at the start how important this is, this designing with security in mind. And the threat modeling is a perfect way to reflect that. So we said the first requirement, RA 1.1, the manufacturer must perform and document the risk assessment for the toe. This is not optional, it has to be done for every device. So what's a toe, you might ask? Well, it's not a foot, and I'm not going to take my shoes off. It is more commonly in the security world referred to as the DUT, the DUT, device under test, but the CRA has decided to call it the toe. So if you're reading through the Act and you keep seeing this toe over and over again, then this is your device, the target of evaluation. So threat modeling, what is it about? We want to analyze the device and we want to work out what the attack vectors are before the product goes on the market and potential attackers have the chance to figure that out for themselves. We want to make sure that we can mitigate any major risks and plan and also build this into the life cycle of the product so that if it gets updated, that we keep on top of it and we're always one step ahead of attackers. So it prevents blind spots, it enables us to prove compliance, and it makes the product more robust over its entire life cycle, especially with the fact of updating this whenever changes are occurring. So threat modeling and risk assessment are often mentioned in the same breath. The easiest way to understand it is that threat modeling provides the input for the risk assessment. So in the threat modeling, we're more loosely defining the possible weaknesses, the attack vectors, and things like that, and mapping them through to more distinct attacks. In the risk assessment, which is done directly afterwards, we can figure out if this happens, how badly is it going to affect my product or system, and how likely is this to happen? You can have a vulnerability that on the surface looks extremely bad, but maybe it requires such levels of privilege to start off with, and maybe it is such a complicated and specific attack that the likelihood of it happening is very small. So this process of doing the risk assessment allows us to kind of put all of these threats that we've identified into an order and attack them from address them from the most severe down to the less severe and less likely ones. So here's a short overview of our threat modeling journey today. We're going to take a look at the system context. We're going to take two devices and look at them at 3 different levels. I think this is really important in this process to have the different perspectives, because as you'll see through the course of this system context, you really take other things into consideration depending on the level that you're zooming in at. Then we're going to look at the STRIDE framework, which is a method of identifying threats. And then we're going to use the MITRE knowledge base, which gives us the opportunity to map these threats to real attack techniques. So here's an overview of the system context. At level 0, we're looking at the object like a black box with wires coming out of it. What does this connect to in its environment, and how does it connect? At level 1, we start to look a bit more closely at the components what's inside the device, where are the boundaries between, where are the trust boundaries, where do we change the level of trust, where do we require authentication and encryption to sort of protect the data as it crosses these boundaries. And then level 2 is the more detailed subsystem view. Here we're looking at specific processes, we're looking at processes inside the device. We're looking at the services, we're looking at the physical ports at this part. And this is the greatest amount of depth that we will go to. Depending on your product, you might not need to go as deep as level 2, but I wanted to cover that today regardless. So here, I'm going to give you an overview of Stride. It's an anagram, so each letter stands for something. First of all, we have spoofing. So spoofing is pretending to be something that you're not. You're maybe pretending to be an admin user because you've got some stolen or some fake credentials. And it's often a foundation for further attacks. This can be you're impersonating a system, for example, a server that a device is speaking to, or impersonating a user within the system itself. Then we have tampering, which means changing something, changing maybe a config, changing logs or changing files. This also covers malware and backdoors. So it's really like altering something about the code of the device. The next point, R, stands for repudiation, which basically means, can you claim that it happened? So the easiest example of this is logs. If you have logging on your system, if anything goes wrong, then you can pinpoint when it happens, from where the problem happens, etc. So this is important to be able to pin down when attackers get into the system. And then we have information disclosure, which is probably the most familiar to you all. This is where information is leaked. It can be through misconfigurations or maybe through error messages. And often this information is a stepping stone and can be used to in other attacks to get even further inside the system. Next up, we have denial of service, which is basically overwhelming the system with so much to do, giving it so much to do that it can't react to authentic users anymore. It causes the system to be unavailable, and it's also a really good distraction technique while you might be doing something else, somewhere else. And the last point of Stride is elevation of privilege. So this is about gaining more access rights, gaining a higher level of access. So moving from the user to admin or root. There are various ways to do this, and it can even lead to the full takeover of the system. So then here's a look at the MITRE attack system. It's fairly complicated, and it's got a lot of technical language in it. It's a list of real-world attacks, and it's broken into sections of the goals of it, like reconnaissance, we have initial access, we have credentials, and then they're broken into the actual methods of how an attacker would exploit that. It's very complicated, and you definitely need a level of technical knowledge to navigate this. I would say in threat modeling, you need this level of knowledge anyway, but there are ways to do it that can make it a little simpler, especially if you're doing it for the first time. And one of these tools is MITRE Embed, which is especially designed for IoT and ICS. And in contrast to MITRE, where you just get bombarded with this huge list of attacks and say, yeah, find the relevant ones, with MITRE Embed, you can click on which components your device has, and it will give you a nice CSV file with the possible threats. Of course, you have to go through all this data and then figure out if these threats are actually really relevant. But it's definitely a simpler, more straightforward system than jumping into MITRE ATT&CK. So you can go to MITRE Embed here and go to the Properties Mapper tool, and you'll see that it'll extend. You click and you'll get more options, and you can refine and define what is in your system and do it that way.